Unauthorised camping constitutes a breach of the rule of law.
History is repeating. A chant echoing through time. Scenes played out over and again on this site. In 1972, a small group of Aboriginal activists transformed an opportunistic accident into the world's longest-running protest, capturing global attention and bringing significant historical and political change in Australia.
Raising a flag saying that we're aliens in our own land and that we're a sovereign people.
We're going to get our bloody land, even if we have to take it.
It's a time to celebrate, but it's also a time to mourn and reflect on 50 years.
From its inception, the Tent Embassy has been interwoven with Canberra's physical and political landscape. Originally a humble beach umbrella, it's grown to become a symbol of Aboriginal land rights and sovereignty activism. The establishment of the embassy remains a pivotal moment in Australia's social history and an icon for First Nations people. The 60s and early 70s were a time for change in Australia. In 1963, the Australian government took 300 square kilometres of land from the Yolngu people in Arnhem Land so mining company Jaminko could extract bauxite.
The situation that's developed because of the wishes of the Yirrkala people has become complex. The cause remains simple: the bauxite.
In 1966, 200 Gurindji stockmen, domestic workers and their families walked off Wave Hill Station, beginning a 7-year strike fighting for equal pay conditions and land ownership.
These Aboriginal stockmen are on strike. This is the Wave Hill mob.
The strike highlighted some of the issues facing Aboriginal people. A year later, the successful 1967 referendum meant Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people would finally be counted as part of the population and provided more momentum to the land rights struggle by raising the profile of Indigenous issues with the wider Australian public.
We didn't see ourselves as Australian. We were Murris, as we say back home. We were Aboriginal people, and they always reminded us of the fact that we were Aboriginal and the fact that there's a place for you Aborigines, and it's not in our white community and not in our clubs and pubs.
On the eve of Australia Day in 1972, the McMahon Liberal government announced its long-awaited policy on Indigenous affairs. It rejected independent ownership of traditional land to Indigenous people in favour of 50-year general purpose leases. It excluded all mineral and forest rights but allowed mining companies to access Aboriginal reserves.
That was pretty much, a bit of a hammering the nail in the coffin for us to shut the lid on the past and say, OK, whatever it takes, here we come. We're coming after what is rightfully ours.
Indigenous groups were appalled at the government's continued refusal to acknowledge Aboriginal rights.
That's what land rights means. That means a lot of money, and that means a lot of people that are getting rich off your blood and guts.
In Sydney, 4 young men came together. They were to change Aboriginal Australia forever.
Michael Anderson, Billy Craigie, Joe Williams and Tony Curry They headed to the nation's capital, but they didn't really have a protest plan.
When we got there, Canberra was raining, and you know, I always imagined that we put it up in the wintertime, but it was January because it was so cold. And we said, well, we're here to confront Billy McMahon and his government, and 4 of us, mind you. And we thought, you know, okay, this is what we're going to do something. We haven't worked that out yet. So then they went through the idea of a hunger strike, and I recall my old mate Billy saying, yeah, well, we've been hungry all our lives, so no, I think we'll pass on that one. And we're going to get someone to feed us anyway while we're at the embassy. At the protest. And then someone said, oh, there was a guy in India, they have a popular way of protesting. They pour fuel on themselves and light them with a match and set fire to themselves. Well, that was out of the question, I can assure you of that. Everyone just looked at each other and sort of shook our heads without saying anything. And then someone else said, well, you know, what do? We go tribal, strip off and stand naked with spears and just wait for someone to come and talk to us. No, that's not on. So anyway, Tony Curry was on the throne down the hallway with the door open, and he was listening to the conversation, and then he called out, he said, this is the home of embassies here. So why don't we just call it the Aboriginal Embassy? And that we were sold on it immediately. And so we ended up with plaques. We made it manila folders, so we made up plaques and tore cardboard boxes and we put these signs up. And then the old man whose house we were at, he didn't have a tent. He said, I can't help you with the tent, boys, but he said, I can give you a beach umbrella. And we took that over, and that became the embassy. We ended up like, you know, an exhibit, I suppose, in a zoo, because I think every car in Canberra, when they realised on the ABC radio that there's 4 blackfellas sitting over there in front of Parliament House under a beach umbrella.
It stands to this day as a testament to the limitations of Australian laws and governments and the lack of action on Indigenous rights.
I know, being younger, we have this fire in our belly and we're really passionate.
Leah House's grandmother Matilda joined the protest on the lawns of Old Parliament House.
It just makes me feel connected. It makes me feel like a part of me was there. And it's why I think I am so passionate today, because I know the history of my family and the connection that we have at that space.
We have come an incredibly long way, and I think we need to acknowledge the founders of the Tent Embassy for having their courage of conviction at a time when it would have been very hard knowing the consequences of setting up a place outside the Australian Parliament.
Those 4 young men, not all of them still with us, really sparked something in this country where the politicians, particularly the fact that it was out of the front of what is now Old Parliament House, had to actually take notice of what First Nations people were saying.
The setting up of an embassy and the intensive pressure for land rights comes from a new generation of Aboriginal spokesmen and leaders. On the whole, they're younger, more impatient and more militant than their predecessors.
Aboriginals think that the country still belongs to them, and all they want is for white man to recognise this fact and acknowledge it, and you know, give them areas back which they decide they want back.
This is one of the most wealthiest countries in the world, per head of population speaking. That to me, it's a scandal that there are so many Aboriginal kids dying from malnutrition, that there are so many blacks living in ghettos, in shanty towns, when in fact this is our land.
The embassy grew from one umbrella to a cluster of dozens of tents that attracted a diverse and articulate group of diplomatic staff, activists and supporters. But for the McMahon government, it was a huge embarrassment at home and around the world. Camping on Crown land was illegal, but considering most Crown land in the Northern Territory belonged to the state, Aboriginal people were exempt. Nobody ever thought that activists would camp in the nation's capital. They had found a gap in the law.
As it turned out, there was not a law in Australia that could stop us from putting that embassy up.
I think the Tent Embassy has had the success it has had, what it had in the 70s, because back then it was such an original stunt. Like what they did, what those men did and what all the mob did in those months after establishing the space had never been done before. And it was in a generation that kind of activism, yeah, it just hadn't been done. It was original. So I think that's why it has stood the test of time.
While the embassy enjoyed wide support, some politicians and members of the general public believe that the protest was nothing more than trespassing and was a blot on the Canberra landscape.
All I'm trying to basically say is that the time of white domination of the black movement is over. It's time for black people to do things for themselves and get things for themselves, because it's the only way they'll ever get anything, and we're getting it.
The fact that the Tent Embassy is still there 50 years on, making a very clear statement about the sovereign rights of First Nations people, making a very clear statement about the condition of Aboriginal Australia, is testament to just how important it was. And I think it's a symbol that has come to represent, to me personally, the struggle, the political struggle in particular, of Aboriginal Australia.
I thought, that won't last long. And then as time progressed, I remembered feeling this is one way to make governments listen by your presence. And over time, we've seen issues that have been covered in some of those debates, but in particular, when the McMahon government were not considering Aboriginal land rights, that's when the Tent Embassy came to the fore. But it's been really just a significant point of reference at which Indigenous people have been able to go there and have their issues promulgated through both media and to members of Parliament.
On the 6th of February, the embassy issued a list of demands: complete rights to the Northern Territory as a state within Australia and the installation of a primary Aboriginal state parliament. These rights would include all mining rights to the land, ownership and mining rights of all Australian reserve lands in Australia, the preservation of all sacred sites in Australia, ownership of areas in major cities including mining rights, compensation for lands that were not able to be returned starting with $6 billion and including a percentage of the gross national income every year.
I like to just think of myself and my three colleagues as the guys who woke Australia up and made the world aware of the fact that there was a problem here.
A visit by then opposition leader Gough Whitlam was seen as a great success in gaining recognition for their cause and having their ideas heard by those in power. On July 20th, during a parliamentary recess in the absence of Labor members, an amended trespass on Commonwealth lands in the ACT was passed, giving the Commonwealth powers to forcibly remove the embassy tents. Hours later, hundreds of Australian Federal Police moved in to dismantle the embassy tents.
The Tent Embassy had been on the lawns outside Federal Parliament for 6 months. It was there on Commonwealth land as a symbolic protest against the federal government's refusal to grant Aboriginal land rights. It didn't persuade the government to change its mind on that, but it did persuade them to pass an ordinance to stop the squatters. It was gazetted this morning, and the ACT police moved in shortly afterwards.
The police are only doing their duty, but it's a pretty dirty duty they've been given to do.
Hey, man, come on, get out. Land rights!
It's bad for the police, but it's bad for the whole nation.
Who's won as a result of today?
I suppose Australia's lost, and the Aboriginal people at least will have everybody in Australia know what they're fighting about tonight.
It was a day in history that, for the first time, Aborigines really clashed with the authorities over fighting for our rights and land.
Later, the police returned in force.
That was pretty violent. It was. I've been in some brawls in pubs, and I've been in a few brawls on rugby league fields, all in brawls. Nothing like this. Nothing like that. And I must say that we met up with some of the policemen later who went to hospital because there were 18 of us went to jail, protesters. There were non-Aboriginal people as well in that. And they fought just as hard as we did.
Images of police violence against protesters spread across the country, leading to even greater support for the embassy and its aims. On July 30th, 1972, 2,000 people marched to Parliament House to reenact the Aboriginal tent embassy. The police removed the tents but let the demonstrators remain. The next month, the government convened the National Conference of Aboriginal and Islander Advisory Councillors.
We will legislate to give Aborigines land rights. Not just because their case is beyond argument, but because all of us as Australians are diminished, while the Aborigines are denied their rightful place in this nation.
Being born Aboriginal in this country is political. You cannot be Aboriginal and not be political. So I do feel it is a responsibility for myself and my family to continue to carry that fight that my nan was a part of back in '72 and has been a part of every day since.
To me, it's about the way we work together to address the inequalities, having the same opportunities, having choices, and being accepted for who they are, not for the colour of their skin or for their ethnicity, but because they happen to be a human being, a unique individual who has the potential to offer so much, not only to their family and community, but to our country, that for 65,000 years our people looked after.
The fire continues to burn there, and it still says something very powerful to the Australian public, and that is that Aboriginal Australia has been here for a very long time and will continue to be here into the future.
How's Michael? He's getting a big boy now?
Yeah.
Let's see, he's 5 months.
By the end of the year, the Department of Aboriginal Affairs was established, and it enacted a range of community initiatives, including a National Aboriginal Health Service. After 9 years of struggle, on August 16, 1975, Prime Minister Gough Whitlam went to Dargaragu and poured a handful of Dargaragu soil into Vincent Lingiari's hand.
I solemnly hand to you these deeds as proof in Australian law that these lands belong to the Gurindji people.
Between 1972 and 1992, the embassy was established at a succession of sites across Canberra. It not only focused on land rights, but protesters also demanded action on funding for Aboriginal communities, self-determination and acknowledgement of sovereign Indigenous nations.
We achieved a lot of things from that Aboriginal embassy, and governments worked with us, particularly Gough Whitlam and Malcolm Fraser when he became Prime Minister. And we were pursuing a great deal of development.
On the 20th anniversary of the original protest, the embassy was permanently re-established on its original site on the lawns outside Old Parliament House. Over the years, the tent embassy has become the focal point for a range of protests, including against Aboriginal deaths in custody, the Howard government's Northern Territory intervention in 2007, and cuts to essential Indigenous services. but the embassy remains controversial. Many have challenged its validity, and a number of arson attacks have damaged buildings within the camp. Recently, First Nation leaders, traditional owners and the embassy condemned protests outside Parliament House following a devastating fire which damaged the facade.
They've disrespected the local values, they've totally disregarded the history, the legacy and the hard fight that our old people have fought here on country.
Elders at the Aboriginal Tent Embassy were dismayed by alt-right and anti-vaccination protests near Old Parliament House.
They need to have a good, hard look at themselves. They are doing no favours to anyone in the way in which they're conducting themselves. I am very disappointed in seeing the coalescing of anti-vaxxers and a so-called sovereignty movement.
I think the problem that I've really watched over the last few weeks as we're watching it unfold has been the total abuse of the trauma of our people and our struggle. And watching that has really activated a lot of trauma within me.
Those protests are at odds with the aims of the Tent Embassy. The symbolism of the embassy has grown from its inception and has taken on different meanings, but it's always provoked and insisted on genuine, respectful engagement with First Nations jurisdictions, laws and governments.
I think the greatest achievement is that why is it there? I think that's everybody's asking. You know, that's what's on the lips of everybody. Why is the embassy still there? And so when they look at themselves in the mirror and ask themselves that question, they have to look over their shoulder to see, okay, well, history hasn't been kind, and maybe we do need to change our discourse in order to improve the status here of Aboriginal people and give the proper recognition.
While the 50th anniversary will be acknowledged with a series of special events, the actual date, January 26, remains a divisive day for many.
It breaks my heart that we have to do this every year.
I don't support changing the date. I support abolishing the date because at the core of it, what it will always represent is the genocide of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. We are still losing our children to the system at higher rates now than we were back in the stolen generations. The incarceration rates for our people, it's just, how far have we actually come? So to celebrate this country and what it represents and what it symbolises and that multicultural narrative, when its very existence represents so much violence, so much trauma, and the genocide of our people.
I see it as a day in which we reflect and then we celebrate as a people. Because to me, I've always had this view that if you take the logic of Invasion Day being the 26th of January, then every day subsequent to the year in which the colony was established is an Invasion Day. So no day would be suitable if we take the logic of what I hear. What we should be doing is saying, why don't we acknowledge that we are still a strength? We were impacted by the history of the past, but we've got an opportunity of moving on. And sometimes I get frustrated. I just wished as much energy was put into debates around domestic violence, the safety of our women, reducing sexual abuse, and closing the gaps on all the targets as we put into one day. Because that's where change will come. We can't turn back the First Fleet. Australia has been developed from that point. Yes, there are many sad points in the connection of our history, but by gee, we've got a lot of good things to celebrate.
It is a very divisive date, increasingly in this country. I'm a realist, and I know that the date's not going to change soon, but we need to remember it was only in 1994 that the date was actually formalised. And there have been many dates for Australia Day over the course of the last 250 years. I don't think that date would be chosen if it was today, because it's divisive. It represents to First Nations people the coming of Governor Phillip and the English claiming Australia. So it is not a day that brings people together. The Australia Day theme is about reflecting on the truth of the story of Australia, of the amazing gift that First Nations people bring to this country, and that's the oldest continuous surviving culture on planet Earth. And the fact that we have been a nation, our nations that have survived, is something for everyone to celebrate.
Despite the date of the anniversary, it is a 50-year legacy of protest and support for the grassroots campaigns around the recognition of land rights, Aboriginal sovereignty, and addressing the very serious issues facing First Australians.
I want to have Aboriginal communities believe and know that we are committed to having their voices heard, and that they have a say in how government programs work at their community level. And I want to join states in that process. So when state and territory governments are working with communities, they're sitting down with them and planning it together, and then implementing the reforms and changes. That's where the change will come, and that's where we will close the gap at the community level.
Change is hard and change is slow, and change usually has to be fought for. And I think that the fact that we've got so many young Aboriginal people today who are asserting their identity, asserting their rights.
The biggest thing that's come out of it for me, and being the granddaughter of Matilda House, who was there in the 70s, is the strength and the power that us younger generations now hold, and how we move forward and how we show up in this colony. And I don't think that can be understated, the strength that our generations draw from that space that has been held by incredible black bodies for 50 years.
The youth, I just want to put it to the youth, they need to paint their picture now into the future, and we'll support and give them every support and guidance we can.